In the late summer of 1942, the world was on fire. But nowhere was the heat more suffocating than in the hangars of Brisbane, Australia. The air didn't just sit. It pulsed with the smell of high-octane fuel, burnt oil, and the sharp metallic tang of welding torches. Deep within the grease-stained shadows of a repair depot, a man who shouldn't have been there was looking at a plane that shouldn't have existed. This was the dawn of a nightmare for the Japanese Imperial Navy, birthed not in a high-tech factory in California, but in a humid shed by a crew of mechanics who didn't care about the rules of aeronautics. Driven by a desperation that borderlines on madness, the men of the 3rd Attack Group were looking for a way to win a war they were currently losing. The Japanese were moving through the Solomon Sea like ghosts, their troop transports protected by a wall of destroyers and the terrifying grace of Zero fighters. High-altitude bombing, the pride of the Army Air Corps, was failing. From 20,000 feet, a ship is a tiny moving speck, and the bombs usually did nothing more than make the Pacific Ocean a little saltier. Something had to change, and that change came in the form of a 42-year-old pilot who was considered too old, too stubborn, and far too dangerous for a standard commission. Before the war, Pappy Gunn had been a family man and a pioneer of Philippine aviation. But after the Japanese invasion, his wife and children were thrown into an internment camp. This wasn't just a strategic conflict for him. It was a rescue mission, fueled by a cold, calculated rage. While the generals in Washington were looking at blueprints, Pappy Gunn was looking at a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber and wondering just how much lead he could cram into its nose. To the experts, the B-25 was a delicate instrument, designed for medium-altitude level bombing. To Pappy, it was a blank canvas for a masterpiece of slaughter. Inside the quiet hangars, the sound of saws cutting through aluminum skin echoed like a death knell. Against every regulation in the flight manual, Pappy and his misfit mechanics began to rip the glass nose off the B-25. They threw away the bombardier's seat, the Norden bomb sight, and the glass panels. In their place, they began to bolt down 4 heavy .50 caliber machine guns. Then, not satisfied with the firepower, they added 2 more on the sides of the fuselage in package mounts. When they were done, a plane that was supposed to drop bombs from the clouds had the forward-firing power of a small destroyer. Every time the brass from headquarters visited, the crew would throw tarps over the modified aircraft. The generals would have called it a crime. The engineers would have said the recoil from so many guns would tear the wings off the airframe. But the men on the ground knew the truth. They were building the Strafer. This was a machine designed to fly so low that the pilots could see the expressions on the faces of the enemy sailors. It was a terrifying evolution of warfare that turned a medium bomber into a massive twin-engine fighter. Before we witness the carnage this Frankenstein bomber unleashed, hit that like button to help us keep these forgotten stories alive. It's the best way to support the channel and ensure the history they didn't teach you in school reaches the world. Standing on the edge of the runway, the first pilots to fly the modified B-25s felt a sense of dread. The weight of the extra guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition made the plane sluggish on takeoff. It sat low on its tires, groaning as it gathered speed. But once it was in the air, it was a predator. Pappy Gunn didn't just want to shoot at ships. He wanted to skip bombs across the water like stones across a pond. This required flying at 200 miles per hour at an altitude of exactly 50 feet. One mistake, one caught wave, or one twitch of the hand, and the plane would disintegrate. In early March 1943, The theory was put to the ultimate test during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. A massive Japanese convoy of 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers was moving toward Leh, carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers to reinforce their crumbling lines. The Japanese commanders felt secure. They knew the American bombers would attack from high up, and they knew their anti-aircraft fire and Zero escorts would be enough to keep the ships safe. They didn't know that the horizon was about to erupt with a new kind of hell. Through the morning mist, the Japanese lookouts saw a line of twin-engine planes approaching. They were shocked to see the bombers weren't climbing. They were descending until they were almost touching the Whitecaps. The B-25s of the 3rd Attack Group came in line abreast, a wall of gray metal screaming across the waves. On the bridges of the Japanese destroyers, the officers scrambled to depress their guns, but the Americans were too low and moving too fast. Then, the world turned into a storm of lead. As the B-25s reached range, the pilots squeezed the triggers on their control yokes. From the noses of the modified bombers, dozens of .50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The sea in front of the ships erupted in a line of white geysers. The heavy slugs raked the decks of the Japanese transports, turning wooden lifeboats into splinters and cutting through the thin steel of the superstructures. It wasn't just fire. It was a scythe. The anti-aircraft crews on the ships were mowed down before they could even load their weapons. Following the hail of bullets came the skip bombs. Dropped at the last possible second, the 500-pound explosives slammed into the water, bounced high into the air, and smashed into the sides of the Japanese hulls. Some bombs exploded on impact. Others skipped right over the decks, detonating in the center of the ships. Within minutes, the invincible convoy was a graveyard. The troop transports, packed with soldiers, began to burn with an intensity that turned the sky black. Hidden in the clouds, the Japanese Zero pilots dove down to protect the fleet, but they found themselves in a nightmare. When they tried to attack the B-25s from the front, thinking they were defenseless, they were met by the same wall of .50 caliber fire that had decimated the ships. The bombers weren't running away. They were aggressive, turning into the fighters and forcing the Zeros to break off. It was a reversal of every law of aerial combat. The medium bomber, the supposed prey of the sky, had become the apex predator. By the end of the battle, the Japanese convoy had been annihilated. All 8 transports and 4 of the destroyers were at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Thousands of troops were lost, and the Japanese ability to reinforce their positions in New Guinea was shattered forever. It was one of the most lopsided victories in naval history, won not by a fleet of battleships, but by a handful of junk planes modified in a back-alley hangar. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the engineering madness of World War II, subscribe to the channel right now. We're uncovering the legends that time forgot, and you won't want to miss what we've got coming up next. Back at the base, the ground crews waited for the return of the strafers. When the planes finally appeared, they looked like they had been through a meat grinder. Salt spray was encrusted on the windshields, and the noses were blackened by the soot of thousands of fired rounds. But as the pilots climbed out, their faces weren't filled with the usual fatigue of a long mission. They were filled with the adrenaline of a new era. They knew that after today, the Japanese Navy would never feel safe in the Pacific again. Inside the cockpit of the lead plane, the floor was littered with spent brass casings, ankle-deep in some places. The modifications that the experts had laughed at had saved the lives of every man in the squadron. Pappy Gunn, the old man of the group, just smiled and started looking for more guns to bolt onto the next batch of planes. He wasn't interested in medals or fame. He was interested in the fact that every ship destroyed was a step closer to the camp where his family was waiting. Reflecting on the legacy of the B-25 Strafers, it's clear that the war wasn't just won by the biggest industries or the most sophisticated computers. It was won by the sheer, stubborn will of men who refused to accept the limitations of their machines. They proved that a tool is only as limited as the imagination of the person holding it. From the old 666 B-17 to the Pappy Gunn B-25s, the Pacific Theater was a graveyard for those who underestimated the creativity of a desperate crew. The story of the Bismarck Sea reminds us that in the darkest hours, when the odds are stacked against us and the equipment we have is considered junk, there is always a way to fight back. It takes a wrench, a welding torch, and the courage to fly 50 feet above a burning ocean. It takes the spirit of a misfit to see a weapon where everyone else sees a wreck. As the sun sets over the rusting remains of the Pacific wrecks today, the ghosts of the strafers still whisper through the jungle. They remind us that history isn't just a series of dates on a page. It is the story of human ingenuity under fire. It is the story of the porcupines of the sky and the men who flew them into the mouth of hell and came back grinning. What's another example of a Frankenstein weapon from history that changed the course of a war? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one and love hearing your insights. Thank you for riding along on this journey through the archives. Stay sharp, stay curious, and keep the engines running. We'll see you in the next one.